Everyone in Copper Falls agreed on exactly one thing about Emmett Holt, and it was this: the old man had never given away a nickel in his life. And he wasn't about to start now that he was dead. They said it at the diner where Maren Holt poured coffee 6 days a week. They said it at the hardware store, at the post office, in the church parking lot after Sunday service. They had been saying it for 50 years, and on the morning of his funeral, under a sky the color of dishwater. They said it one last time, quietly, the way people speak ill of the dead, which is to say, constantly and with great enjoyment. Maren stood at the edge of the grave in her only black dress and counted the mourners. 11. 4 of them were family. 2 were from the funeral home. 1 was the pastor, who was being paid. The rest, she suspected, had come to make sure Emmett Holt actually went into the ground. Her grandfather had been 91 years old. He had lived alone in the big brick house on Tallow Ridge for as long as Maren could remember, with its shutters always closed and its porch light never on. And he had spent 9 decades perfecting the art of being impossible to love. He haggled with children over lemonade. He charged the church interest, actual interest, compounded monthly when the roof fund ran short in 1987, and Pastor Wheeler came to him on bended knee. He had repossessed a man's truck on Christmas Eve. That last one might have been a legend, but in Copper Falls, legends about Emmett Holt had a way of being true. He's probably negotiating with the devil right now, her Uncle Dale murmured beside her, not quite softly enough, trying to get a better rate on eternity. Aunt Rosalind laughed into her handkerchief. Her cousin Trent didn't bother hiding it at all. He chuckled with his hands in the pockets of a suit that cost more than Maren made in a month, his eyes already sliding toward the road, toward his car, toward the lawyer's office where, at 2 o'clock that afternoon, the will of Emmett Holt would finally be read. Because that was the other thing everyone in Copper Falls agreed on: the old man was rich. Nobody knew how rich. He had owned the mill once, and half the storefronts on Main Street at one time or another, and there were rumors about land, about mineral rights, about accounts in 3 states. 50 years of never spending a nickel had to pile up somewhere. The family had been circling that pile for a decade, patient as buzzards, and now finally, gloriously, the old man had died and left it unguarded. Maren was the only one who cried at the funeral, and she honestly couldn't have said why. She hadn't known him. That was the strange part. 28 years in the same small town, and she could count on 2 hands the conversations she'd had with her own grandfather. He had cut her mother off before Maren was even born, some quarrel no one would ever explain. The kind of family wound that scabs over into silence, and after her mother died. When Maren was 19 and suddenly very alone in the world, Emmett Holt had not come to that funeral. He had sent nothing, not a card, not a call. And yet, twice a year, every year, she would look up from the counter at Dot's Diner and he would be there, in the corner booth, ancient and gray as a heron, drinking black coffee and reading the paper. He never spoke to her beyond ordering. He tipped exactly 15%, calculated to the cent, and he always watched her when he thought she wasn't looking, with an expression she could never read, something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief, as if she were a bill he couldn't figure out how to pay. Then he would leave, and she wouldn't see him again for 6 months. So no, she couldn't have said why she cried. Maybe you don't cry for the person. Maybe you cry for the door that stays shut your whole life, and then one morning turns into a wall. The pastor finished. The dirt went in. Dale checked his watch. 2 o'clock, he said to the family, brisk as a man leaving one meeting for a better one. Quigley's office. Don't be late. He said it to Rosalind and Trent. He did not say it to Maren, because it did not occur to a single member of the Holt family that Maren would be in the will at all. The law office of Barnaby Quigley occupied the 2nd floor of the old bank building on Main, above the insurance agency, at the top of a staircase that complained about every step. Quigley himself was around, careful man of about 70, with reading glasses pushed up into what remained of his hair, and he had been Emmett Holt's attorney for 40 years, which, people said, made him either the most patient man in the county or the best paid. At 2 o'clock exactly. He cleared his throat and looked at the 4 people arranged in front of his desk. Dale had taken the center chair without asking. Rosalind sat beside him with her purse on her knees like a small dog. Trent leaned against the windowsill, scrolling his phone, and Maren sat by the door, half convinced she'd been summoned by clerical error, still in her funeral dress. With coffee smell in her hair from the morning shift she hadn't been able to afford to skip. "Thank you all for coming," Quigley said. This will be brief. Emmett was not a man who wasted words, and his will is, in most respects, the shortest I have ever drafted. He unfolded a single sheet of paper. It was last revised 14 months ago. It is valid. Witnessed. And I will say this now, because I suspect it will come up. It is ironclad. I made sure of that myself. He paid me extra to make sure of it. A thin smile. It was the only time I ever knew him to pay extra for anything. Just read it, Barney, Dale said. Quigley read it. To my son, Dale Holt, I leave my 1998 Buick Regal, which he once called an embarrassment, so that he may finally be embarrassed in comfort. The room went very still. To my daughter-in-law, Rosalind Holt, I leave my late wife's China service for 12, minus the one plate Rosalind broke at Thanksgiving in 1994 and blamed on the cat. I counted. Rosalind, I always counted. To my grandson, Trent Holt, I leave $500, and the sincere hope that he will spend it more wisely than he spent the $5,000 I lent him in 2019, which as of the date of this document he has repaid at a rate of $0 per year. Trent had stopped scrolling. The house on Tallow Ridge and all its contents are to be sold, with proceeds distributed as directed in the sealed letter held by my attorney, the contents of which are to remain private until such time as the conditions of the final bequest are satisfied. What conditions? Dale's voice had gone tight and pale. What final bequest? Where's the money, Barney? Quigley turned the page over, and for the first time that afternoon, he looked at Marin. To my granddaughter, Marin Holt, he read. I leave the black ledger kept in the bottom drawer of my desk, and the key that opens it. She is to collect every debt recorded in its pages, in the order they are written, beginning within 7 days of my death and finishing within 1 year. If she completes the collection, she will understand what she has inherited. If she declines, or fails, or if any other member of this family interferes with the collection. Quigley's eyes moved slowly across Dale, Rosalind, and Trent. The entire estate, in its entirety, will be donated to the Copper Falls Public Library, an institution I have selected specifically because no member of my family has ever set foot in it. The silence that followed had a texture to it, thick and furry, like mold. Then Dale laughed. It was not a nice laugh. A ledger, he said. The debt book. He left her the debt book. He turned around in his chair to look at Marin fully, maybe for the first time in years, and his face was doing something between fury and delight. You know what that is, don't you? That's the book, the famous book. 50 years of every nickel anyone in this town ever owed that old vulture. He's dead, and he's still trying to squeeze Copper Falls, and he picked you to hold the squeezer. He shook his head. Wonder and contempt in equal parts. The waitress. He left the collections job to the waitress and the fortune to a sealed envelope. That's, you know what? That's perfect. That's him. That is just exactly him. Dale, Rosalind murmured. No, it's fine. It's fine. He stood, buttoning his jacket, already reassembling his composure the way rich men and almost rich men do. She'll fail. Look at her. She can't collect a debt from a jukebox. The clock will run out. We can test the will, and the adults will handle the estate. He bent down toward Marin on his way to the door, close enough that she could smell his aftershave, and his voice went soft and almost kind, which was worse. Sweetheart, do yourself a favor. Sign whatever Barney needs you to sign to decline this. Go back to the diner and stay out of the deep water. It's what you're good at. The stairs complained all the way down. Rosalind followed. Trent lingered a moment at the windowsill. He looked, briefly, like he might say something human, and then he didn't, and he left too. Quigley waited until the street door banged shut below. Then he opened his desk drawer and took out a book. It was smaller than Marin expected. In her imagination, the famous Holt ledger had grown to the size of a tombstone. But the real thing was maybe 9 inches tall. Bound in black leather gone gray at the corners, soft with 50 years of one man's hands. A brass lock held it shut. Beside it, Quigley set down a small brass key on a loop of string and a plain white envelope with her name on it in handwriting like barbed wire. He wrote you a letter, Quigley said. He instructed me to give it to you only if you accepted. Marin looked at the book, somewhere below, out on Main Street. Dale's car door slammed like a judge's gavel. Stay out of the deep water. It's what you're good at. I accept, she said. The envelope contained a single index card. On it, in that barbed wire hand, were 3 sentences. Every debt in this book is real. Collect them exactly as written, or not at all. Start with Ada Pruitt. The key turned with a click like a knuckle cracking. Maren opened the ledger that night at her kitchen table, in her small rented house on Birch Street, with the window fan rattling and a cup of tea going cold beside her. Her hands, she noticed, were not entirely steady. The first page was not what she expected. She had expected columns, numbers, the cold arithmetic of a miser. And there were columns, dates on the left, names beside them, sums on the right, page after page in that same wire fence handwriting, growing shakier as the decades passed, but at the top of the very first page, before any of it, her grandfather had written a single line, underlined twice, pressed so hard into the paper that it had embossed the 3 pages beneath it. A debt is a promise written down, and below that, the first entry, dated April 3, 1974. Ada Pruitt, $1,240 collateral held due upon my death. 1974, 50 years ago, whatever Ada Pruitt had borrowed money for. She had been carrying this debt since before Maren's mother was in high school. And Emmett Holt, that patient old spider, had sat on it for half a century, waiting to collect from beyond the grave. Maren flipped forward. Names she knew filled the pages. Half the town was in here. Sam Pruitt, Pastor Wheeler, Dot Almquist, her own boss at the diner, Harlan Boone from the hardware store, the Vasquez family, the Kowalskis. On and on, hundreds of entries across 50 years, some small and large, and beside almost every one. In the margin, the same 2 abbreviations repeated like a heartbeat, CH, collateral held in that final, patient phrase, due upon my death. He hadn't been collecting while he lived. That was the strange thing, the thing that itched at her as she turned the pages, debt after debt after debt, and almost nothing marked paid. What kind of moneylender never collects? The kind, said Dale's voice in her head, who'd rather own people than money. She closed the book. Outside, a car rolled slowly down Birch Street, paused near her mailbox, and rolled on. She told herself it was nothing. On the last page she had dared to look at, she had not gone to the end. Something about the end of the book frightened her in a way she couldn't name. A small slip of paper was wedged into the spine. A list, in Quigley's tidy lawyer's print, of addresses, every name in the ledger, and where to find them. Ada Pruitt, 14 Quarry Road, widowed 1998. Maren was a waitress. She was 28 years old. She owned a 9-year-old Corolla and $400. And tomorrow, on her one day off, she was going to drive to 14 Quarry Road and demand $1,240 from an 80-year-old widow because a dead man she barely knew had asked her to, and because her uncle had told her she couldn't. She turned off the light and lay awake a long time. Quarry Road was 3 miles of gravel east of town, and number 14 was a white farmhouse with a sagging porch and a garden out front so beautiful it looked like an apology for everything else. Roses climbed the porch rails. Sunflowers stood guard along the fence like tall, drowsy soldiers. Maren sat in her car at the end of the driveway for 6 full minutes, rehearsing sentences that all sounded monstrous. Hello, my dead grandfather says you owe him money. Hi, I'm here about a debt from the Nixon administration. The front door opened before she reached the porch. The woman standing behind the screen was small and white-haired and sharp-eyed, wearing a men's flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled, and she looked at Maren for a long, unhurried moment. Well, said Ada Pruitt, you'd be the granddaughter. Yes, ma'am, Maren Holt. I'm sorry to bother you, but he's dead. Then, it wasn't a question. Saw it in the paper. Meanest man in Copper Falls. Ada said it the way you'd recite a town's founding date flat, automatic, worn smooth. Then she pushed the screen door open. You'll want coffee. This is going to take longer than you think. The kitchen smelled of coffee and tomatoes ripening on the sill. Maren sat at a table older than she was and put the ledger on it, and Ada Pruitt looked at the black book the way people look at a casket. So it's real, Ada said quietly. He always said there was a book. 50 years I half thought he invented it to scare us. She poured 2 cups, sat, and folded her hands. Go on, then, read me mine. Maren opened to the first page. Her voice came out thinner than she wanted. April 3, 1974. Ada Pruitt, $1,240. Collateral held due upon, she made herself finish, upon my death. For a moment, Ada Pruitt did nothing at all. Then she laughed one short, hard bark of a laugh, and then, to Maren's horror, her eyes filled with tears. And the 2 things happened together on her face, the laughing and the crying, like weather that can't make up its mind. $1,240, Ada said. You know what that was? That was a funeral. That was my boy's funeral. She wiped her eyes with the back of a garden-brown hand. Matter of fact. Danny, our oldest, 17 years old, drowned at the quarry, April of '74, and Sam and me, we were young. The farm was mortgaged to the chimney, and we could not pay to bury our own son. Do you understand what that does to a man? Girl Sam didn't sleep. He was talking about digging the grave himself. The fan hummed. Somewhere outside, a wind chime tried a few notes and gave up. And then Emmett Holt knocks on that door. This door. She nodded at it. 9 o'clock at night. Stands right where you walked in, hat in his hands, and says he's heard about our trouble, and he'll cover the funeral, every cent. And Sam. Sam was proud, prouder than we could afford, Sam says. Holt, we can't take charity, and you don't give it? And Emmett says, Ada's voice changed, dropped, took on gravel, an imitation polished by 50 years of retelling. It's not charity, you damn fool. It's a loan. I'm writing it in my book, and I'll collect when it suits me, and it won't suit me for a long while. Charity's for strangers. Debts are between neighbors. Myron sat very still. He paid for the whole thing. Casket, stone, flowers, the lunch after. And then he stood in the church parking lot, in front of everybody, and complained loudly that Sam Pruitt owed him money and he'd better see every penny of it. And he stomped off like a crow, and the whole town clucked their tongues about that terrible Emmett Holt, hounding a grieving family. Ada shook her head slowly. He did it on purpose. Don't you see, he made himself the villain so nobody would ever look at us and see charity cases. My Sam could hold his head up at the feed store, because as far as Copper Falls knew, he hadn't been given anything. He owed. Owing's respectable. Owing means somebody judged you good for it. But, Marin said, and stopped, and started again. But he never collected. 50 years. He came by every few years and glared at the roses and said, that debt still stands, Ada Pruitt. And I'd say, I know it, you old buzzard. And he'd take one tomato one off my sill like it was a payment, and leave. She was smiling now, and crying again, neither one winning. Sam went to his grave owing Emmett Holt $1,240, and it was the only debt he was ever proud of. Marin looked down at the ledger. A debt is a promise, written down. The words seemed to rearrange themselves as she watched. Mrs. Pruitt, I don't think I can take your money. I don't want it. I'll mark it forgiven. You'll do no such thing. Ada's voice cracked across the kitchen like a dish towel snapping. You will collect this debt, girl, exactly as written, because that man kept his end of the bargain for 50 years and I intend to keep mine. Sam would climb out of the ground and scold me. She stood, went to the hallway, and came back with a shoebox, old, soft-cornered, tied with kitchen string, and set it on the table in front of Marin with the gentleness of someone handling a sleeping child. He held collateral, Ada said. That's what the book says. Doesn't it collateral held? Well, here's the other half of that. 2 weeks after the funeral, Emmett came back and gave us this box and said, You'll hold this for me until the debt is called. Don't open it. Don't lose it. 50 years it's been on the top shelf of my closet, and I have never once looked inside, because he asked me not to, and because, and here her voice finally broke, all the way through, because as long as that box was in my house, some part of that awful, wonderful old man was still keeping an eye on us. You understand, the debt was never money. The debt was the string between our houses. She pushed the box across the table. Paid in full, Ada Pruitt said. Go on and write it, so I can see. With unsteady hands, Marin took the pen from the loop in the ledger's spine as pen. She realized, worn to the shape of his grip and beside the first entry, in the space he had left blank for 50 years, she wrote the words, paid in full, and the date, and her own name. Ada watched. Then she nodded once, the way farmers nod at a sky that has finally decided to rain, and put both hands around her coffee cup. There were more of us, she said quietly. You know that by now. I expect. That book's full of us. She looked up, and her sharp eyes had gone bright and fierce. Go collect, girl. Go collect every last one. And when your family tells you what kind of man your grandfather was, and you'll know exactly how much they never knew him. In the car, at the end of Quarry Road. Marin untied the kitchen string with shaking fingers and opened the box. Inside, wrapped in yellowed newspaper from April 1974, was a framed photograph of a laughing teenage boy on a tractor, Danny Pruitt, 17 forever. And beneath it, a savings passbook from Copper Falls First National, opened in 1974 in the name of Daniel Pruitt Memorial Scholarship, into which, in a wire fence hand, deposits had been entered twice a year, every year, for 50 years. The last page held a sticky note, curled with age. For the Quarry kids, AP decides who. Tell her Danny's name goes on it, not mine. Maren sat in her Corolla on a gravel road with a dead boy's photograph in her lap, and understood, with a feeling like a floor giving way, that she had 211 entries left to collect. By the end of the first week, Maren had collected 4 debts, and she had stopped sleeping properly, though not for the reasons she'd expected. Entry 2 was Harlan Boone at the hardware store, $300 dated 1981. And when she read it to him across his own counter, the big man's ears went red, and he disappeared into the back room for so long she thought he'd climbed out a window. He came back carrying a rifle case, and for one absurd moment, Maren's whole life flashed before her eyes, and then he laid it on the counter and opened it, and inside was not a rifle, but a rolled sheaf of papers. Store was going under in 81, Harlan said, not looking at her. Interest rates were 18% and the bank was a week from taking the building. Emmett Holt walks in, buys a single box of wood screws, counts his change twice, you know how he did, and then says, quiet. So nobody else hears, I hear the bank circling. Boone, I don't like banks. They're careless with towns. Next morning, his lawyer calls. He'd bought my note, whole thing. And his terms. Harlan laughed, rubbed his jaw. His terms were, I pay him back whenever, at whatever, but the debt stands in the book till I say otherwise. And I keep his collateral in my safe and never open it. And if anyone asks, I complain about what a bloodsucker he is. That last part was in there like a real condition. Miss Holt? He made me practice. Made me say that Skinflint Holt is bleeding me dry until it sounded natural. The rolled papers were the deed to the hardware store building, signed over, notarized, dated 1981, held in trust. Emmett Holt had owned Boone's Hardware for 43 years and charged rent of exactly $1 per year, billed annually, with a late fee schedule attached. Harlan had framed one of the invoices. Rent due $1. Failure to pay will result in consequences. He never once told me what the consequences were, Harlan said, and his voice wobbled on it. 40 years. I paid that dollar on the 1st of January like it was a church service. Entry 3 was Pastor Wheeler, the famous church roof loan of 1987, the one the whole town knew about, the one that had made Emmett a legend of stinginess, because he had actually charged the church compound interest, and everyone knew it. What no one knew, because the pastor had been sworn to a silence he'd kept for 37 years, was where that interest went. The collateral in the church safe was a ledger within the ledger, a bank book showing every interest payment deposited straight back into an account labeled Roof Fund 2, which had quietly paid for the furnace in '94, the flood repairs in 2002, the wheelchair ramp in 11. The church had been paying interest to itself for 4 decades. Emmett had simply been the mean face that made the arithmetic invisible. He told me, Pastor Wheeler said, folding and refolding his glasses, that a town needs somebody to blame the winter on. He said, you be the mercy, Wheeler, and I'll be the weather. Entry 4 was her own boss, Dot Almquist, $8,800 dated 2009, the year the recession nearly killed the diner. And the collateral Dot had been holding for 15 years, wrapped in a dish towel in the bottom of the freezer, was the deed to Dot's diner itself, plus a sealed envelope on which was written, in wire fence letters, the girl stays employed. That is the interest. Dot cried into her apron. Maren had to sit down on a milk crate. The girl. 2009. Maren had been 13 years old in 2009, a kid doing homework in the corner booth while her mother waited tables. And she had worked at Dot's herself since she was 16. Hired the summer, her mother got sick, kept on through every slow winter when Dot, by any sane arithmetic, should have cut staff. He had been paying for her all along. Not with kindness, never once with kindness, but with leverage, structured like spite. That night she spread the collected collateral across her kitchen table, a scholarship passbook, a store deed, a church bank book, a diner deed, 4 sealed instructions, A pattern was assembling itself in front of her, and the shape of it made the hair stand up on her arms. He hadn't been hoarding money. He had been distributing it for 50 years, in secret, disguised as debt and stashing the ownership papers of half of Copper Falls in shoeboxes and freezers and church safes all over town, each one guarded by a person who thought they owed him. The town was the vault, the debtors were the locks, and the ledger, the famous, hated ledger, was the only map, which meant the book on her kitchen table was worth exactly as much as the entire estate of Emmett Holt, which meant she needed to think very carefully about the car that kept rolling slowly past her mailbox at night. Dale came to the diner on a Tuesday, which was already strange, because Dale did not eat at places with laminated menus. He took the corner booth, his father's booth. Though he wouldn't have known that and ordered coffee, he didn't drink. And when her shift ended, he was still there. And he smiled at her, like a man about to do her an enormous favor. "Sit down, sweetheart. 5 minutes." She sat. Because in a town like Copper Falls, you can't make a scene with your own uncle in your own workplace. And he knew that, which is why he'd come. "I owe you an apology," Dale said, palms up, disarming. "At Quigley's, I was grieving. I was shocked I said things. The truth is, I've been thinking. And I think Dad gave you a raw deal. And I'd like to fix it." He slid a folded paper across the table. "That's an offer, a real one. You sign the book and its contents over to the estate, to the family, where it belongs, and you walk away with that number. Today, no driving all over the county knocking on doors like a repo man, no year of your life wasted. That number. Marin, look at it." She looked at it. It was a large number. It was, in fact, more money than she had ever imagined attached to her own name, enough to leave Copper Falls. Enough for the community college brochures that had been sitting in her kitchen drawer for 6 years. Enough that her hands wanted to sign before her brain finished reading. "How do you know what's in the book is worth more than this?" she asked. Something flickered behind Dale's smile, fast, reptile fast, gone. I'm buying peace of mind, that's all. Family shouldn't be at war over an old man's mind games. Because if it's just a list of small-town I owe us from 50 years ago," Marin said slowly, "then this offer is insane, and if you know it's worth more than this, then you know what he was actually doing, which means you always knew, which means everyone standing at that funeral calling him the meanest man in the county." "Careful," Dale said softly. "It was in on the joke or too greedy to get it. Which was it? Uncle Dale, did you know?" The smile went away entirely, and what was underneath it was much older and much colder. And for a second she could see the whole shape of him, a man who had spent 60 years being the son of a legend of meanness, waiting for the payout that made it worth it. "I know this," Dale said, standing, buttoning his jacket. "That book is a 50-year-old pile of unenforceable paper being carried around in a Corolla by a girl with no lawyer, no money, and no idea what she's holding. Contracts get contested, wills get contested, girls get tired." He dropped a 20 on the table for the coffee he hadn't drunk, overpaying, so she'd have to make change or owe him. An old trick of his father's, used with none of the love. "The offer expires Friday. After that, we do it the expensive way. Yours expensive, not mine." The bell over the door jangled behind him. Dot came over with the coffee pot and refilled Marin's cup unasked. "You all right, hun?" He offered to buy the book. Dot snorted. "Course he did. You know what your grandfather used to say about Dale?" She dropped her voice into the gravel register that every person in Copper Falls apparently kept loaded for Emmett Holt imitations. "I raised a boy who thinks the price of a thing is what it's worth. God knows where he gets it. Probably me." She topped off the cup. "He'd sit right there in that booth and watch you bust tables and say that, like it hurt him someplace." Marin went home, and she did 3 things. First, she photographed every page of the ledger with her phone and emailed the pictures to herself, to Quigley, and to Ada Pruitt's granddaughter in Ohio, who was a paralegal. Second, she took the collected collateral, the deeds, the passbooks, the sealed envelopes to Quigley's office, where the old lawyer received them with no surprise whatsoever, unlocked a cabinet that turned out to be a safe, and revealed, stacked inside, dozens of similar envelopes. "He moved his papers to the debtors gradually," Quigley said. "Starting about 20 years ago, whatever came back to me for safekeeping. I hold pending the completion of the collection. You're not building the estate. Miss Holt, you're reassembling it. He scattered it like a jigsaw. on purpose, into the only hands he trusted. He peered at her over the reading glasses, which, you may have noticed, were not his family's. "Why?" Marin asked. "Why like this? Why not just a normal will, a foundation, a lawyer? Why make a 28-year-old waitress drive around the county for a year?" Quigley was quiet for a moment. "You've read 4 entries, he said at last. "Ask me again at 200. Third, that night." Marin took the ledger to bed like a Bible and finally did the thing she had been afraid to do since the first evening at her kitchen table. She turned to the end of the book. The last several pages were newer, the paper whiter, the wire fence hand grown shaky and enormous. An old man's writing. She found the final entries, 2019, 2021, 2023, and then the very last one, dated 14 months ago, the same week he had revised his will. The ink was pressed deep, the way he'd pressed the first line 50 years before. There was no sum, there was no collateral held. There was only this, final entry, M. Munch owed everything, see page 71. Marin's own initials in a dead man's hand. She turned to page 71 with her heart walloping and found the neat, razor-clean edge of a missing page, cut out recently by the look of the paper. Someone had already been inside the book. Quigley examined the cut edge under his desk lamp for a long time, tilting the book, running his thumbnail along the margin like a man reading Braille. "Razor," he said finally. "Single pass, steady hand, flat surface. This wasn't done in a hurry." He looked up. "And it wasn't done recently. See how the exposed edge has yellowed to match the paper around it? I'd say this page has been gone for years. Miss Holt, possibly decades. Whoever cut it out did it while Emmett was alive. Could he have cut it out himself? He could have. Though I'll tell you this, I watched that man refuse to throw away a rubber band for 40 years. Emmett Holt did not destroy records. He was the record." Quigley closed the book gently and slid it back to her. Page 71 would fall in. He did lawyer's arithmetic behind his eyes. The mid-90s, given his pace. What happened in the mid-90s? Marin didn't answer, because the answer was sitting in her chest like a swallowed stone. Her mother had left Copper Falls in 1996, pregnant and 23 and alone, and had not spoken to her father again for the rest of her life. That was the family wound, the scabbed-over silence, the quarrel no one would explain. The quarrel, Marin was now almost certain, was on page 71. She kept collecting, because the will gave her no choice, and because the collecting itself had become a kind of trance. Through July and August, she worked the ledger the way she worked a full Sunday counter methodically, entry by entry, no favorites, no skipping. The pattern held and deepened and grew stranger. The Vasquez family. 1989, a debt that turned out to be tuition, 4 years of it, for a daughter who was now doctor. Elena Vasquez, with a family practice in Cedar Rapids. The collateral in their attic was 30 acres of orchard land signed into trust, with instructions that it never be sold to anyone who wouldn't farm it. The Kowalskis, 1993 bail money, of all things. For a 19-year-old son, one bad night from a felony record. The boy was 50 now and had driven a school bus without a single incident for 26 years, and he wept like a child at his own kitchen table when Marin marked the entry paid. Miss Deverell, the retired teacher, 2001, a debt that was actually the mortgage on the little house where she'd tutored 2 generations of Copper Falls kids for free. Every Tuesday, including Marin realized with a jolt, sitting in that same front room where she had once sounded out chapter books, including Marin herself. Not every door opened. Entry 118 was a man named Gus Tiller, and Gus Tiller was the legend, the actual, original legend. The truck, Christmas Eve, 1988. Emmett Holt had repossessed a working man's truck on Christmas Eve, in the snow, in front of the man's children, and Copper Falls had been polishing the story for 36 years until it gleamed like an ornament. It was the first thing anyone said about Emmett Holt and the last thing they said at his grave. Gus Tiller was 74 now and lived alone at the fish camp out past the county line. And when Marin pulled in, he was waiting on the porch with his arms crossed, because in a town that size, word of the girl with the book traveled faster than the Corolla did. "No," he said, before her door was even shut. "Mr. Tiller, I know what you're doing. Whole county knows. Driving around handing out happy endings. Everybody crying in their kitchens about what a secret saint the old devil was." He came down one porch step, and his voice had 36 years of grindstone in it. "Well, here's one for your collection. Girl, he took my truck, Christmas Eve. My kids watched out the window while his man hooked it up, and Holt stood in my yard in that gray coat with a clipboard and didn't say one word, except, "You knew the terms." My boy was 6. He asked me if we'd been robbed. I said, "No, son, this is legal." He spat, accurate and unhurried, into the frozen flower bed of his own memory. There's no shoebox out here. There's no secret scholarship. Some debts are just debts, and some mean old men are just mean, and you can write that in the book. Maren stood by her car with the ledger against her chest, and did the only thing she knew how to do. The thing 4 months of kitchens had taught her. "Can I read you your entry anyway?" she said. "You don't have to do anything. The will says I collect as written or not at all, so if there's nothing to collect, I'll need you to tell me that after you've heard it. Then I'll go." Gus Tiller glared at her for a long moment. Then he jerked his chin. "Get on with it." She found the page. December 24th, 1988. Gus Tiller. Collateral seized 1979 Ford F250. She stopped, read the next line twice to herself before she trusted her voice with it. "Debt none. He owed me nothing. I owed him a fast answer and gave him a cruel one. See continuation, March 1989. "What?" said Gus Tiller, very quietly. She turned the pages. March 1989. G. Tiller, continued. Truck sold at auction to Halloway Freight. Deke Halloway presiding. Purchase price $400. She looked up. Mr. Tiller, who was Deke Halloway? The old man's arms had come uncrossed. Deke hired me that spring. Best job I ever had. Drove for Halloway Freight 19 years. Retired out of there with a pension. He hired me off the street in March of '89, said he'd heard Gus stopped. His face was doing something complicated. Said he'd heard I was reliable. Pizza purchase price $400, Maren read. Plus one condition, binding Halloway hires the man in April, driver's rate, and never tells him why. Tiller's note was 90 days past due because he was feeding 3 children on strike pay and too proud to say so. And a proud man will let a truck go before he lets a neighbor see his kitchen. So the truck went loud and the job came quiet. He will hate me for the rest of his life. That is the price, and I've paid worse for less. A man can hate you warm and fed. E.H. The fish camp was very quiet. Down at the water, something jumped and settled. There's a continuation of the continuation, Maren said. Because there was, in shakier ink, dated just 2 years ago. Halloway died 2019. Condition of silence dies with me. If Tiller ever hears this, tell him the strike was right, the terms were wrong, and the truck ran another decade for a man who needed it less. Also, his boy asked if they'd been robbed. They had been. By the mill, by the winter, and by me, in that order. 2 of the 3 are paying it back with interest, collateral held for the 3rd. She reached into the tote bag Quigley had prepared for entry 118 the executor had known. Of course he had known. He'd been settling the dead men's entries all summer, and she took out the last item and put it in Gus Tiller's cracked hands. It was a toy truck. A 1979 Ford F250 die-cast, worn to bare metal at the corners, the kind of thing a 6-year-old holds up to a window, taped to the roof. A note bought at the same auction, been in my desk 35 years. Tell the boy. Gus Tiller stood on his porch steps holding a toy truck, and Maren watched 36 years of a town's favorite story break apart in one old man's face like ice going off a pond. Not gently, not gratefully, in pieces, with grief and fury for the decades spent hating a man who had let himself be hated on purpose. He could have just told me, Gus said finally, and his voice came out ruined. Any day for 30 years, he could have knocked on that door and told me. Yeah, Maren said. He wasn't able, it ran in the family. She marked the entry, no sum to collect, nothing owed, paid in full, 1989, and left the old man sitting on his steps, rolling a toy truck an inch forward and an inch back on his knee, the way you do when you are 6, or when you are 74 and 6 at the same time. That one she cried about in the car. Some of them she cried about in the car. Entry after entry. The meanest man in Copper Falls dissolved and reformed into something the town had no word for. Not generous generosity was sunlight, and Emmett Holt had worked exclusively in shade. Every gift wore a disguise of debt. Every kindness came zipped inside an insult. He had spent 50 years buying the town out of its emergencies and then paying extra in reputation. The only currency he ever truly spent to make sure no one felt owned, no one felt pitied, no one ever had to be grateful to his face. You be the mercy, Wheeler, I'll be the weather. And through those same weeks, the weather around Maren herself turned. It started small. A letter from a law firm in the city, on paper so heavy it felt wet, informing her that the will was being contested on grounds of undue influence and diminished capacity, and inviting her to preserve all documents in her possession. Then a second letter. Then the diner's landlord, a property company Marin had never heard of, found a problem with Dot's lease, purely routine. Then a man in a gray sedan photographed her house on a Sunday morning, unhurried, window down, and gave her a little wave as he pulled away. And she recognized the wave. It was Dale's wave, hired out. "He's spending real money now," Quigley observed, reading the third letter. "Which tells us he's certain the estate is large, which tells us..." He set the letter down. Someone gave him a reason to be certain. "Trent," Marin said. She'd worked it out slowly, the way you notice a draft. Trent, who owed his grandfather $5,000 humiliating dollars. Trent, who had lingered at Quigley's windowsill, looking almost human. Trent, who had grown up in and out of the big brick house on Tallow Ridge in the years when Dale was still speaking to the old man, a bored teenager in a house with one famous forbidden object in it. She found him at the driving range on the edge of town, hitting balls alone in the heat with his tie thrown over his shoulder, and she stood at the rail until he had to look at her. "You got into the book," she said, "years ago. You're how your dad knows what it's worth." Trent hit another ball, watched it the whole way down. "You can't prove that. I don't have to prove it. I just have to say it out loud in front of you. And look at your neck go red." It was going red. When how? He was quiet for 3 more swings. Then, without turning. 16, Grandpa fell asleep in his chair. Key was on the ring on his belt like always. I'd heard about the book my whole life. Dad talked about it like it was a treasure map. So I looked. Expected pirate stuff. A humorless little laugh. It was the most boring thing I'd ever seen. Names and numbers, Pruitt, Boone, Church, blah. I told Dad there was nothing in it but small-town us, and he called me an idiot, said the old man had to be hiding the real assets somewhere. And honestly, we stopped thinking about the book for years. It wasn't until Quigley read the will, till the old man built his whole estate around it, that Dad understood the book was the estate. And page 71, Trent finally turned around, and Marin saw, with surprise, that whatever this was, it wasn't triumph. He looked like a man carrying something that had been too heavy for a 16-year-old and had never gotten lighter. "I didn't cut it," he said. "It was already gone when I looked. 12 years ago. That page was already gone, but..." He glanced around the empty range, lowered his voice as if the golf balls might report him. "I saw the entry before it, page 70. Bottom line, I remember it because it was the only entry in the whole book where the handwriting went to hell. Everything else, that barbed wire printing, neat as a fence, this one looked like he wrote it in a moving truck." He recited it slowly, eyes closed, a thing memorized without meaning to. October 1996, CH, and it didn't mean collateral held, it was initials. Initials of a person, CH, owed an apology, interest compounding. C.H. Caroline Holt, her mother. "That's all I know," Trent said. "I swear, Dad doesn't know about that entry. I never told him, because..." He faltered, and for a second, 16 again. "Because it wasn't money, and everything I tell him gets turned into money." He picked up another ball, put it down. "Marin, for what it's worth, the $5,000 he lent me, I was going to pay it back. I just kept waiting till I could hand it to him all at once, so he'd have to be impressed. And then he shrugged at the sky. So you owe the book," Marin said. "You're in it. Entry 206, I checked." Trent laughed, wet-eyed, disbelieving. "You're actually going to collect on me." "Exactly as written," she said. "That's the deal." She found the truth about October 1996, the way she found everything that summer, by knocking on a door in the ledger. Entry 71 was gone, but entry 72, the next debt her grandfather had recorded, 3 weeks later belonged to a woman named Bertie Nash, who had cleaned the Tallow Ridge house twice a week for 30 years, and who was now 93 and living at the Copper Falls care home with a view of the parking lot and a memory like a bear trap. "Cut it out himself," Bertie said. Before Marin had even finished asking, I watched him do it. The room hummed with the sound of oxygen and daytime television turned down to a murmur. Bertie Nash sat propped in her chair like a queen of somewhere small and looked at Marin with eyes gone milky at the rims but dead clear in the center. November of '96. Caroline had been gone a month, He sat at that desk all night. I came in the morning and the lamp was still burning and he hadn't been to bed. And he had the book open and a razor blade out of his shaving kit. And I watched Emmett Holt cut a page out of that ledger like he was performing surgery on his own chest. Then he folded it in thirds, put it in an envelope, and sealed it. And he saw me in the doorway and he said, "The gravel imitation again, the town's shared inheritance, but gentler in this old woman's mouth than in anyone else's. Bertie, some debts a man's got no right to keep on paper he owns. This one gets held by the creditor." "The creditor," Marin repeated, meaning he mailed it to my mother. "Drove it," Bertie said. 400 miles. I know because I packed him sandwiches and he complained about the mustard for a decade after. He drove to that little apartment where your mama was, and whatever happened at that door, he never said. And I never asked but the once, and the once. He stood at the window a long time, and then he said, "She kept the page, Bertie. She wouldn't keep me. But she kept the page." Bertie's hands, folded on her blanket, tightened around each other. "He went back every year. You know, every year of your mama's life. One drive, 400 miles. And every year she kept the page and shut the door. Stubbornness ran in that family like copper in the hills." Her clear old eyes fixed on Marin. "Runs." Marin's mouth was dry. What was the quarrel? What did he do to her? In 1996, that was worth a page in that book. "That," said Bertie Nash, "is written on the page, and the page belongs to the creditor. And the creditor, God rest her." She nodded, slow and certain, at Marin, at Oliver, at the shape of her face that Marin knew from the mirror and from one photograph on a dead woman's dresser. "Left everything she had to you, didn't she? Every box you never went through, every envelope you couldn't bear to open. Girl, you've had page 71 for 9 years. The boxes were in this back of her closet, where they had been for 9 years, behind the winter coats, underneath the deliberate forgetting. 3 boxes. Everything her mother had owned that Marin hadn't been able to give away or look at: the hairbrush, the nursing textbooks, the church dress, the shoebox of photographs, the biscuit tin of papers that 19-year-old Marin had shoved to the bottom because papers were the worst part. Papers had her mother's handwriting on them. And handwriting is a voice you can still hear. She sat on the closet floor with the biscuit tin in her lap for 20 minutes before she could open it. Insurance forms, a hospital bracelet, Marin's own birth certificate, report cards hers, saved, every one, a pressed carnation gone the color of weak tea, and at the very bottom, flat and square and folded in thirds, an envelope with no address, soft as cloth from handling, the way paper gets when it has been taken out and held and put back 1,000 times over a lifetime. Her mother had not kept it sealed. The flap was open. Caroline Holt had read this page, had reread it, by the wear of it, over and over, year after year, and had still never once picked up the phone. Or, Marin thought, with a hollow feeling, had reread it every year, and kept the door shut anyway. Because keeping it shut was the only power she had left, and had held on to that power the way you hold a debt. Stubbornness ran in that family like copper in the hills. She unfolded page 71. The top half was a ledger entry, October 1996, in handwriting that looked exactly as Trent had said, like it had been written in a moving truck or by a man whose hands would not obey him. Caroline Holt owed an apology, interest compounding, no collateral, nothing held. I held nothing back, and that was the whole of the crime. And the bottom half was a letter, the only letter, as far as Marin would ever learn, that Emmett Holt wrote in his entire life. "Caroline, you came to me for a loan, and I gave you a lecture. That is the plain arithmetic of what happened, and I will not dress it up. You stood in my kitchen, 23 years old, and scared and proud, my God. Girl, the pride. Where do you suppose you got it? And you asked me for help. And you asked me the right way, the way I taught this whole town to ask. You said, write it in your book, Daddy. You said, I'll pay you back. I don't want a gift. Write it down. You knew me. You asked me in my own language. And I looked at the man you'd chosen and the trouble you were in. And I decided the loan you needed was a lesson. And I told you that a girl who'd made your choices could come back when she was ready to make better ones. And I watched you walk out of my kitchen. And I wrote nothing down. 50 years I've written every promise in this book. The night you left is the only night I ever refused a debt. And it was the only debt that ever mattered. Here is what I have learned since, at great expense. From a customer base of one empty house money I have, money was never the thing I was hoarding. When your mother died, I closed up some part of my accounts that no one, including me, has been able to open since, and I've spent 30 years lending everything except the one asset anybody ever wanted from me. You wanted your father. I quoted you a rate you couldn't pay. I do not ask you to come back. Debts aren't collected by the debtor's convenience. You know my rules. I ask only this: hold the page. Hold my debt. Let it stand in your keeping and compound, and know that every year it stands, I know exactly what I owe, down to the cent, and that a man who knows what he owes is not yet past saving. The baby, Bertie tells me you named her Marin for your mother. I'm keeping an eye on the both of you. You will never catch me at it. Catching me at things was your mother's job, and the position remains unfilled. Your creditor and your father, E.H. Marin read it 3 times on the closet floor. Then she cried the way she had not cried at 19, or at the funeral, or at Ada Pruitt's kitchen table, long and hard and gracelessly, for all of them at once, for a proud, scared girl in a kitchen in 1996, and a proud, stupid old man alone in a lamplit study cutting out his own heart with a razor blade, and 400 miles driven every year in both directions of a door that never opened, and 28 years of corner booth coffee, 15% to the cent, from a grandfather keeping an eye on her from 6 feet away because closer had a price he'd convinced himself he had no right to pay. The meanest man in Copper Falls, interest compounding. When she was done, she washed her face, and she took the page back to the ledger, and with the tape from her kitchen drawer she put page 71 back where it belonged. The creditor was dead. The debt came home. Then, because it was Thursday and Dale's offer expired Friday, she called Quigley. I need to understand the sealed letter, she said. The one with the distribution instructions. The will says it opens when the collection's complete. What counts as complete? Every entry. Every entry, Quigley said. Collectible is written. Deceased debtors' entries passed to their estates, most of those I've been quietly settling behind you all summer. You've noticed the paperwork moves fast when you leave a house. A dry pause. There are 213 entries. As of this morning, you have collected 211. Marin looked at the book. Final entry, M.H. owed everything. 206 is Trent, she said. And the last one is me. Quigley, how do I collect a debt from myself when I don't know what it is? Everything isn't an amount. And see page 71? I've seen page 71. It's an apology to my mother. What do I owe? Miss Holt, said Quigley, and there was something in his voice she'd never heard from him, something almost gentle. I have represented that man for 40 years, and if I have learned one thing, it is that Emmett Holt never once wrote down who owed whom in the way you'd expect. Read the entry again, carefully, the way a lawyer reads. She read it again. Final entry, M.H. owed everything. Not owes, owed. Every entry in the ledger, all 213, was written from the same side of the table what was owed to the book's keeper. Ada Pruitt owed, Harlan Boone owed, the church owed, for 50 years, one direction. Except the 2 entries about his own blood. Caroline Holt owed an apology, written the other way, a debt he owed her. M.H. owed everything. It wasn't her debt. It was his. The final entry in the famous ledger of the meanest man in Copper Falls was the old man's own confession, entered in his own collections book, of everything he owed his granddaughter, the funeral he hadn't attended, the calls he hadn't made, the door he had spent 28 years not knocking on from 6 feet away. He had made himself the last debtor in his own book, and then he had died, and left her the book, which made her the creditor of record. To collect from a debtor's estate, Quigley said quietly down the line, as if he could hear her getting there. The creditor presents the debt to the executor, and the estate pays. I am the executor. Miss Holt, present the debt. How? He left instructions. You're to come to the office. You're to bring the book. A pause, and the smile was audible now. And you're to bring, and I quote, anyone in that town fool enough to still be holding my collateral, which, if I have done this right, is all of them. Dale made his move first. Of course. Men like Dale always spend their best card the day before the game ends. Friday morning, 9 o'clock. A process server was waiting at the diner with an emergency motion, a temporary injunction, granted by a judge 2 counties over, freezing all assets, instruments, and records of the estate of Emmett Holt, including, named specifically, in italics, 1 black leather ledger pending a competency hearing. Surrender of the ledger to the court was ordered within 72 hours. Dale himself arrived at 9:15, in time to watch her read it. He took the corner booth, He ordered coffee. "You had a good summer," he said, and he sounded genuinely warm, which was the most frightening thing he'd done yet. "I mean that. Drove all over, met the folks, heard the stories. I'm sure they were moving. But here's what happens now. Sweetheart, the book sits in an evidence locker for 3 years while my lawyers argue that a 91-year-old man who structured his estate as a scavenger hunt was not of sound mind. And you know what? They might even be right. And every one of those touching arrangements, the scholarship, the $1 a year rents, teacher's house, the orchard, all of it unwinds into one big pile of contested assets, and the pile gets divided by blood, the way it should have been from the start." He stirred his coffee. Tink, tink, tink. "Unless you sign my offer before 5 o'clock, in which case I withdraw the motion. The pile divides quietly, and you're rich. Last chance. Marin, the adults are done waiting." Marin looked at the injunction, then at her uncle, and it occurred to her with a calm that felt like her grandfather's hand on her shoulder that Dale had made the one mistake that 50 years of Copper Falls could have warned him against. He had put his threat in writing. 72 hours, she said. "So Monday?" "Monday," Dale agreed, magnanimous in victory. "Then I'd like to invite you," Marin said, standing, untying her apron, "to a reading. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. at Quigley's office. It's about what you're owed, Uncle Dale. It's all written down." They didn't fit in Quigley's office. That was the first thing that went wrong with whatever picture Dale had in his head. They didn't fit. Because Marin had spent Friday afternoon making phone calls down the list of 213 entries, and Copper Falls had answered. So Quigley, unflappable, moved the reading to the church, which was the only room in town big enough, and which, as Pastor Wheeler observed from the doorway, to anyone who'd listen, Emmett Holt technically still held a note on, so it seemed only right. By 10 a.m., the pews were full. Ada Pruitt sat in the front row with the shoebox on her knees. Harlan Boone had closed the hardware store first time since his mother's funeral and sat with the rifle case that held a deed. Dot came with the whole diner staff in a thermos. The Vasquez family drove in from 3 towns. Dr. Elena Vasquez flew in from Cedar Rapids and sat next to Miss Deverell, whose reading student she had once been, in the little house that a debt had saved. The Kowalski boy, the 50-year-old bus driver, wore a suit. Bertie Nash arrived from the care home in a wheelchair pushed by 2 nurses who had refused to let her come alone. And she surveyed the packed church with the satisfaction of a woman who had dusted every secret in that town personally. And in the 3rd row, stiff as fence posts, Dale, Rosalind, and Trent. Quigley stood where the pulpit usually went, put on his reading glasses, and held up a sealed envelope, foxed with age, heavy with wax. "These are the distribution instructions of Emmett Holt," he said, "to be opened upon completion of the collection, as of 9:45 this morning." He nodded at Trent, and the whole church turned to look. And Trent, crimson, held up a cashier's check for $5,000 like a hall pass. 212 of 213 entries stand collected. The final entry is a debt owed by the estate itself, presented this morning by the creditor of record. The estate will now pay. He broke the seal. "To the people of Copper Falls." Quigley read, "If you are hearing this, then the girl did what I believed she would do, which is everything, which is what she is owed, which is the last sum in my book. For 50 years you have held my collateral, and I have held your promises. Here's the accounting. Every deed, trust, and instrument held in your homes is hereby executed as written. Boone keeps his store. The church keeps its roof, and I forgive the interest. Wheeler. So you can finally stop pretending you don't hate me. You were the only man in town who never once managed it convincingly. And I want it known I found that hilarious for 37 years. The Pruitt Scholarship stands funded in perpetuity. Ada decides it was always going to be Ada. The orchard goes to farmers. The diner goes to Dot. And the house on Tallow Ridge, which my will says shall be sold for $1. To the Copper Falls Public Library for use as a branch. $1 being a price I've had good results with. I told you all it would go to the library if you crossed me. Emmett Holt does not bluff. He merely arranges to win either way. To my son Dale, you are owed exactly what the book says you are owed, and I want you to know I checked twice. You appear in my ledgers 0 times in 50 years, not because I never offered. Dale, because you never once asked me for anything except everything. A debt is a promise written down, and you never made me a single promise. And so, by the only arithmetic I ever trusted. I owe you the Buick. It's a good car. I kept the receipts. To my grandson Trent, your $5,000. When it arrives, and it will arrive, he'll wait until it can impress somebody. He's more mine than his father ever was, is to be entered as the founding deposit of a fund for any young person in this county who needs bail, tuition, or a funeral, and cannot ask out loud. Trent administers it, give him a book to keep, and see what he becomes. I have a suspicion. And to Marin, the church, which had been rustling and weeping and at the Buick, openly laughing, went absolutely still. Everything else, the accounts, the land, the mineral rights the rumors were right about, and the item Quigley will hand you when this letter is done. You collected 212 debts that were never about money, so you already know the money is the smallest thing I'm leaving you. What I am leaving you is the same thing I left this town proof, written down in my own hand, that you were never once out of my accounting. Not 1 year, not 1 day. I watched you carry plates the way your mother carried herself, like the weight was nothing and the pride was everything. And I sat in that booth every 6 months and paid my 15% and could not find the courage that an 80-pound widow on Quarry Road showed me in 1974, which is the courage to knock on a door and say the debt out loud. So I'm saying it now, in front of the whole town, in the only voice I ever trusted, which is ink. I owed you everything. Consider this my payment on account. The balance, the years, the door, the empty chair at your mother's funeral cannot be paid, and I will not insult either of us by rounding it down. Some debts you don't settle. You just make sure the interest goes somewhere. It all went to you. It was always going to you. Ask Bertie. Paid in full as I am able. Signed, the meanest man in Copper Falls, who has survived, to his everlasting profit, by his granddaughter. Quigley folded the letter. In the third row, Rosalind was gripping a pew like a woman at sea. Trent had his face in his hands, and Dale sat staring at nothing. A man doing and redoing a sum that would not come out in his favor, because the currency had been changed on him 50 years ago, and he was the last one in town to be told. Then Quigley took out the final item, small, flat, wrapped in yellowed newspaper from October 1996, and walked down from the pulpit and put it in Marin's hands. It was a photograph in a plain frame, a hospital room, a tired, fierce, laughing young woman, her mother, 23, alive, so alive, holding a newborn. And there, at the very edge of the frame, half out of the shot, caught in the doorway like a man who had promised himself he was only passing by an unmistakable gray heron of a figure, hat in his hands. He had been there, the day she was born, 400 miles from home, the year of the cutout page. He had been standing in the doorway. On the back, in wire fence handwriting, one line. Entry number 1, the real book E.H. The library branch opened on Tallow Ridge the following spring, and the town, with a straight face and a unanimous council vote, named it the Holt Memorial Library, largely because everyone agreed the old man would have absolutely hated it, and hating things had been his love language. And Copper Falls had finally, 50 years too late, learned to speak it. Marin kept the ledger. Quigley offered a museum case. She declined. It lives where it always lived, in the bottom drawer of the desk in the study on Tallow Ridge, in the room where the librarians now let a certain former waitress work at odd hours. Because she funds the building, and because she is studying for the accounting degree she is too old for and exactly on time for, and because she keeps a book of her own now. It's small, black, locks with a brass key. There are already 11 entries. A kid at the community college whose textbooks are recorded as a loan, terms whenever, at whatever. A repair bill at the care home, held against collateral, one photograph of Bertie Nash, age 20, on a horse. A young family's first month's rent, entered at compound interest, payable on demand, demand indefinitely postponed. Each debtor holds a sealed envelope. Each has been made to practice complaining about her. Because a debt is a promise written down. Because owing is respectable. Because every town needs somebody to blame the winter on. And on the first page, underlined twice, pressed so hard into the paper that it embosses the 3 pages beneath, the new keeper of the book has written the whole inheritance in a single line. The glass never mattered. The ledger keeps its promises. She crossed that out. Wrong story. Old habit. What we owe each other is the only fortune that compounds. Entry number 1 is dated the day of the funeral. It reads, Emmett Holt owed everything paid in full.